Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 82 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Seattle Kraken, in which the Sharks have lost 3-0. It is now the end of a long and grueling regular season. The San Jose Sharks have not made it to the postseason, and that result has been known for mathematically just a few weeks, but realistically for almost a couple of months at this point. And so besides the brief excitement that came from that victory against the Vegas Golden Knights just a few days ago, there really hasn't been much to play for from the San Jose Sharks perspective as of late, so the games haven't necessarily been super exciting. And as we come to the end of this year with this game against Seattle, it was a pretty good representation generally of how this season went for the San Jose Sharks, where they are shut out by a team lower than them in the standings. The Sharks' issues this year really have stemmed almost entirely from the fact that they just lack a lot of offensive firepower, and 0 goals here tonight really does go to show that. And generally, this game was not really well played from the Sharks' perspective compared to just yesterday against the Edmonton Oilers, where the Sharks looked like the better team, played a very solid game, but unfortunately came up with the wrong side of it at the end of the overtime. Here tonight, Seattle looked better. The Sharks looked tired, they looked lost, and most of all, they looked kind of just checked out. There was even a point in this game where the Sharks had a 5-on-3, had a lot of zone time, but couldn't even manage a single actual shot and good chance on net, and it was just generally a bit of a mess of a game from the Sharks' perspective. Then they end up with 0 goals. It starts off in the first period. The Seattle Kraken are dominant in that opening frame. They take a 2-0 lead that they would never relinquish, obviously, and in the second period, the game would go scoreless, and in the third period, it would be an empty netter added for Seattle. To make matters worse, in this empty net situation, the Sharks were playing 6-on-5, but you wouldn't necessarily know it from having watched the game, because in this 6-on-5 situation, the Sharks played more in their own end than they played in the Seattle end, and had to spend a good 20-30 seconds defending and trying to block shots in their own zone to prevent the Seattle Kraken from scoring on the empty net. So it was a bit of a disaster of a game, you could say, and not a great way to end this season. They certainly did not do so on a high note. Having said that, when it comes to the players to talk about, I'm actually not going to dwell on how these players actually played here tonight, and instead I'm actually going to take a brief review on how they looked this season and going into next year, which I of course will expand on in future videos. So starting off with Timo Meyer, had a very, very strong season, potentially the Sharks' best player on the entire roster. I would say is only really competing with James Reimer, and I would still put Timo Meyer ahead of him. Compared to the career year that he had 3 years ago in 18-19, where I thought he was good, but nothing super special or anything of that nature, here this season I thought he really made a name for himself. Great career year, and so the 18-19 Timo Meyer didn't really consist and go forward in the 1920 and 2021 seasons, and I'm not going to sit here and say that the 21-22 Timo Meyer is now going to be the one we will see from now on, but I would say it does inspire a bit more hope. On the other hand, I would say Tomas Hertl kind of ended up in an opposite type of situation. Back when he had his career year in the 18-19 season, I thought Hertl was completely dominant on the ice, looked like one of, if not the best player for the San Jose Sharks, looked just absolutely like a dominant force every single time he stepped on the ice. I had drawn comparisons to Evgeny Malkin at that time when it came to Tomas Hertl. This season, I still thought that Hertl was good, but not nearly the form that he was at those few years ago. Now, of course, Tomas Hertl did recently sign an extension with the San Jose Sharks, $8 million for 8 years that starts next season. So Tomas Hertl is going to be a name that we will likely be talking about in association with the San Jose Sharks for a long time. But while this season was solid, 30 goals, you can't really criticize it, I am expecting a bit more out of him as a player. His line mate Barobanov, also a very solid season for himself. He had played about 9 games at the end of last year on a line with Hurdle and Kane, and it was expected that he could come into this season just based off of that 9 games looking pretty good. I even made the bold prediction that he'd managed to hit the 50-point mark, and while he didn't hit that mark, he did come extremely close. I believe over a full 82-game season, he would have hit around 47, 48 points, so definitely quite solid, and he had good chemistry on this first line. When it comes to the Sharks' second line here, Logan Couture, definitely a very strong bounce back year compared to last season, which is actually somewhat surprising because Couture did get to play with, I would say, slightly more skilled players last season compared to this year, where occasionally, of course, like at the start of the season, he was paired with Timo Meyer, but many times this season he's been given line mates like Bonino, like Nieto, like Gregor, who aren't necessarily the worst of players, but aren't necessarily either the player who you would place with someone to try and inflate their offensive numbers. So the fact that Couture was able to come into this season and actually still put up in over an 82-game season, sort of prorated over about a 60-point year, is actually rather impressive. When it comes to Nick Bonino, a new San Jose Shark, as he was brought in this past offseason, did not start the season particularly well on the offensive side of things. The first quarter of the year, he didn't manage a single point, if I'm not mistaken. And then through the middle parts of the season, while he was starting to get some points, he was not playing particularly well on the frequently Sharks third line. But as of late, and there will be some recency bias in this, as of late on the wing here with the Sharks' second line of Couture and Nieto, he actually has looked a lot better, which has begged the question of whether or not he may end up playing the wing for the San Jose Sharks next season. It would actually be somewhat of a surprise to see something like that, considering Nick Bonino, you would, like, the first thing you think about Bonino is that he is a center, and he would be more of a third to fourth line center for any sort of team. But if that's exactly where he plays well, and that seems to be the case over these past few games, maybe that's something in his future. When it comes to Matt Nieto was put in a bit of an awkward situation thus far this season, because I don't think Nieto actually played necessarily awful at times this year. He's been a decent part of the Sharks' penalty kill, and while he was on that really bad third line at a point, I thought he was always maybe the bright spot of that bad third line, I would say. But he's also in a tough situation, but that for whatever reason, Bob Booner is really in love with Matt Nieto, and so will frequently play him up in the lineup and randomly give him shifts and overtimes, which kind of turns people off from him. But generally, that's not necessarily his fault. That's the coaching's fault. I think Matt Nieto is perfectly serviceable as a fourth line player, and if the Sharks were to keep him as such, I do think that they could definitely bring him back for another year, though with Bob Booner at the helm, maybe that's actually a risk. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, Gregor started the season a bit awkwardly. He would frequently he started the season in the AHL, we should say, but when he got brought up to the NHL, he would frequently get some chances, which obviously made it easy for him to get spots in the lineup, but he wouldn't actually be able to convert on those chances. And so after a few games of being able to play up in that top six with players like Couture on the second line, he would end up getting demoted and bouncing around the third and fourth lines because there were opportunities there, but there was no finish. But with the arrival of Thomas Bordeleau, Gregor has actually looked a lot better as of late, which does give some hope going into next season if Gregor can actually be a relatively consistent offensive producer on a Sharks third line. Still not good enough, I would say, to be a top six forward at all, but playing on the third line, you definitely wouldn't look too bad. When it comes to Thomas Bordeleau, he's obviously been a massive surprise at the end of this season. Obviously was hyped up as a Sharks rookie, but when it comes to that team in Michigan, he looked good, but he was also playing with a lot of very good players. Owen Power, the first overall pick from last season, Matty Beniers, who we just saw here tonight, the second overall, Luke Hughes, the fourth overall, and so he was playing with a lot of great players, so it was hard to necessarily attribute him to that team's success. But Bordeleau really has come out here and played exceptionally well for the San Jose Sharks, looked extremely promising, and it's nice that he was able to get these games under his belt, and hopefully he can come into next season with a training camp also with him and actually perform very, very well. It'll be interesting to see if he ends up getting locked to this third line center spot, or if maybe he'll end up flexing even a bit higher in the lineup. I don't think he'll end up on the wing, though it's technically possible, but maybe a second line center position, having Couture move down to the third line center position could be possible, considering if we're already looking at the lineup here, Couture is kind of already playing on a sort of third line with Bonino and Nieto, and at least based on offensive outputs. When it comes to Rudolfs Balcers, also had an a decent season, I guess. At the start of the year, wasn't necessarily doing much that well, but also kind of the recency bias situation has come into effect as of late, where he's been much better when placed with Gregor and Bordeleau on this third line. So I guess in the end, it wasn't a terrible season for Balcers. On the fourth line, we had a couple of substitutions for this game. I was a bit surprised to see Shemelevsky come out of the lineup because I thought he's been really good as of late, but Reedy ended up staying in the lineup. He also started the season with the Barracuda, came up and didn't really make much of an impact, but like the others, has looked better as of late, and so we'll see how that manages to carry over into the next season. Could be a fourth liner for the San Jose Sharks who gets some time on a second power play unit going into next season. When it comes to Lane Peterson, I doubt he's going to be part of the fabric of the San Jose Sharks moving forward into next year. He really did not impress at all. He was brought in by Doug Wilson to potentially be a competitive player on the Sharks' fourth line, and he was given a lot of opportunity to do so and never really blew anybody away. And when it finally comes to the last player here, Jonathan Dowling, maybe one of the more interesting players for the San Jose Sharks, because he started the season very, very well on a top line with Meyer and Couture, looking exceptional, honestly, in that particular role. Was going to be a potential even dark horse for a Calder nomination. I didn't think he was ever really going to win it, but he could. I thought with how he started, he could be like a fourth place, fifth place type of vote. But he ended up kind of cooling off a bit on that first line. They were still together, but not necessarily doing as much as they were in the early parts of the season. And then he went down with that injury around December time. And when he came back, he just didn't really seem to be himself. Had a couple of games here or there where he did stand out in a positive way, but mostly found himself on the third line, on the fourth line, and just not really contributing. So it'll be very interesting to see what Dowling's role coming into next season actually is. Will he be able to actually find a spot in the Sharks starting 12 lineup, or will something else happen? Will he move down to the Barracuda? Or maybe we already saw Dowling earlier on in his career not really want to deal with things in the AHL, and so he ended up going overseas. Will something like that happen? Hard to say. On the defensive side of things, we have Brent Burns, who also had a pretty up and down season. I mentioned this in the previous review that Brent Burns has been better as of late, looking quite solid on this pairing with Mario Ferraro, but there were so many games this season where he was just an absolute downright liability for the San Jose Sharks, where I don't necessarily hold out a lot of hope going into next season, where he's going to be 37, turning 38 in March, that he's going to still be a player who's going to be able to rack up a ton of minutes. I mean, I saw a stat today that Brent Burns actually this season has the most minutes that he has ever played in a particular year, and the fact that that's happening at the age of 36 is not necessarily a great sign, because eventually that age will catch up to him, and we saw many times this season that seemed to be the case. When it comes to Ferraro, he kind of didn't really take that step forward that I was expecting from him. He still has a lot of heart, yada yada yada, and I know a lot of people like to think of him as the future captain of the San Jose Sharks once Logan Couture is gone, and that very well could happen, but it'll be interesting to see what exactly goes on with Mario Ferraro's contract in this offseason, because if he had indeed taken that step forward this season, the Sharks could have maybe been in a bit of a cap issue signing that Ferraro contract. But now, with him not necessarily having played all that well, it'll be interesting to see if whether or not he takes a 1 to 2 year proven deal, or maybe he signs slightly more long term but at a lower dollar amount. When it comes to the second pairing here for the San Jose Sharks, Nick Milosh has been given a lot of time thus far this season, at least as of late, and honestly, he's okay. He seems like on a good team he could maybe be a 6th defenseman, but probably a 7th defenseman. It's just that the Sharks have been, I wouldn't necessarily say forced, because I know Bob Booner does like Milosh for whatever reason. I think Milosh is decent. I don't think he's necessarily super deserving of a consistent lineup spot. And if there was a position that the Sharks could potentially be looking to replace, I guess you could say, it would be on the defensive depth type of situation. Obviously, there were a couple injuries for the San Jose Sharks when it came to Erik Karlsson, and of course the year-long injury of Nikolai Knyzhov, but Milosh just doesn't really seem like, if this team wants to get back to the playoffs, a player who they would want to have in their top 6. On the other hand, Megna, a player who plays a similar game to Milosh, which is more so on the defensive side of things, could be an interesting player for the San Jose Sharks to look at this offseason. Unlike Milosh, who will be a restricted free agent, Megna will actually be an unrestricted free agent, so the Sharks would have to consciously make the decision to try and re-sign him during this offseason. I do think that would actually be the correct choice if they can get him on the cheap. He does have pretty decent synergy with Erik Karlsson, I would say, and so why not do so? And finally, the final pairing, there is Marc-Edouard Vlasic. He had a season that has been highlighted by the fact that he could be okay in a couple of games, but mostly is just completely a shell of his former self. That's just absolutely guaranteed. I mean, it's really realistically been the case for the past couple of seasons, and nothing has really changed here. Vlasic is doing not that great. Many of the times that the Sharks are against actual good teams, Vlasic doesn't really do much, and so that's just kind of the case at this point. I know a lot of people do want to buy out the contract of Marc-Edouard Vlasic during this upcoming offseason. I don't think that's the correct move for the Sharks, just because it would be such a burden on their cap hit, and I don't think Vlasic has necessarily reached the point yet where he's so bad that you'd rather buy him out compared to someone like Martin Jones last season. But I guess we'll see. And then there is finally Ryan Merkley, who I thought at times looked very good this season, at times looked decidedly average this season, and of course at times looked quite bad. Extremely up and down games that he has played, but I feel like there were more positives than there were negatives, and so hopefully he will get a longer look with some preseason and training camp going into next season, and he can be a consistent player in the Sharks' top 6 next year. And finally, we have the goaltender. I will actually mention Reimer as well, but first Kakinen, who came over from the Minnesota Wild at the trade deadline. Honestly, this season I feel like a lot of people have kind of been overrating Kakinen. He has had a few solid games with the San Jose Sharks for sure, but there have also been a lot of goals that have just been kind of beating him clean, especially here tonight. The Larson one deflects off of Nick Bonino, so I won't say that was his fault, but the shot by Gord is kind of one that he is able to see and yet doesn't make the save on, and I feel like there have been just a few too many weak goals for Kakinen to really put hope into him to be some sort of future effective goaltender for the San Jose Sharks, in my eyes at the very least. He's certainly not bad, but many people saying, oh, they really need to bring a Kakinen back, or, oh, if they trade James Reimer, they can just have Kakinen be the starter. If the Sharks really want to try and make the playoffs next season, I don't think Kakinen as the starter is necessarily going to be good enough to get them there. And then when it comes to James Reimer, obviously didn't play here tonight, and unlike Kakinen, who I did feel was a bit overrated, like I mentioned earlier, James Reimer is up there with Timo Meyer for best player on the San Jose Sharks this season. He was absolutely heroic in so many of the Sharks' wins, and even in many of the Sharks' losses as well. He also kind of had an issue like Kakinen did, where he'd kind of just get beaten very cleanly a few too many times, but unlike Kakinen, it's a bit more excusable for James Reimer because of the amount of times he bailed the San Jose Sharks out. It was something that I mentioned a couple of times earlier this season, that it's very weird about Reimer, where he'll make about 10 high danger saves and then he'll face a low danger shot and actually let it in. It's a bit odd, but Reimer has been good enough for the San Jose Sharks thus far this season. But that will do it for this review, if you want to call it that. The Sharks will be back in action all the way next year in October, and so we just kind of have to put ourselves behind maybe one of the playoff teams, or just sort of wait through this excruciatingly long off season before we get to watch more Sharks hockey. Class dismissed.